Number 9. Liao Qian-sung. Captain Liao Qian-sung and his co-pilot Liu Tse-chung weren't necessarily at fault when the TransAsia Airways plane they were flying crashed in northern Taiwan shortly after takeoff, but they had a role in the situation that occurred. 2 minutes into the flight, the pair reported an engine flameout. After climbing to an altitude of 1,510 feet, 460 meters, the plane began to descend rapidly, clipping a taxi and then a guardrail, before ultimately coming to rest in the Keelung River. Out of 53 passengers and 5 crew members on board, only 15 people survived. Both pilots died in the wreck. Qian-sung's body was found gripping the joystick, showing that he did everything in his power to minimize the number of lives that would be lost upon impact. The mayor of Taipei praised the pilots for working so hard to avoid hitting buildings before ditching in the river. Flight data showed that both engines lost power shortly before the crash. An anonymous tipster claimed that one of the pilots had urged for a last-minute inspection of the aircraft shortly before takeoff, indicating that perhaps something might be gravely wrong with it. But this claim was later found to be untrue, and that neither pilot had made such a request. Investigators determined that the pilots had misdiagnosed the engine problem and that someone had mistakenly shut off the plane's second engine, which showed no signs of malfunctioning. It was ultimately determined that numerous factors contributed to the disaster, including ineffective flight crew coordination, communication, and threat and error management. Number 8. Stephen Silver. Trans-Colorado Airlines Flight 2286 was a regional flight between Denver and Durango, Colorado. On January 19, 1988, the small twin turboprop aircraft crashed a few miles outside Durango, La Plata County Airport, as it approached for landing. After descending at 3 times the recommended rate for the approach, the plane struck the ground, then pitched up and rolled several times before hitting the ground and screeching to a stop. There were 17 people aboard, including 15 passengers. 9 of them died, including Captain Stephen Silver. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, investigated the accident and found that First Officer Ralph Harvey had a history of alcohol abuse, but he was found to be drug and alcohol-free at the time of the crash and was cleared of any responsibility. At some point during the investigation, another pilot informed the NTSB that a woman had approached him claiming to be Captain Silver's fiancée. She reportedly said that she had used a bag of cocaine with him the night before the accident. The NTSB never got a hold of the woman, but traces of cocaine were found in Silver's blood and urine, confirming her claims. Based on the evidence, it appears as though the captain used cocaine between 12 and 18 hours before the flight, and that his drug use probably affected his judgment and flying skills. While the nature of the plane's descent is what ultimately caused the crash, this was the first time that a pilot's cocaine use was cited as a contributing factor in an accident that killed passengers. Number 7. Clayton Osborne. It's scary enough to be on a flight where a fellow passenger begins acting erratically, but can you imagine how terrifying it would be if the pilot had a meltdown in midair? That was the reality for 135 passengers aboard JetBlue Flight 191 on March 27, 2012. During the trip from New York to Las Vegas, Captain Clayton Osborne allegedly began hitting random buttons and telling air traffic controllers to quiet down. He started talking nonsensically to First Officer Jason Dowd, saying that they needed to take a leap of faith, that things don't matter, and that we're not going to Vegas. Then he started rambling about religion. He also turned the communication radio off and dimmed the equipment monitors. Co-pilot Dowd tricked Osborne into going into the passenger compartment, then locked the cockpit door and changed the code. When Osborne couldn't get back in, he told passengers to say their prayers. He then reportedly ran down the aisle, ranting about Jesus and Al-Qaeda, but was subdued by passengers who tied him up with seatbelt extenders. In the meantime, Dowd manned the aircraft with the help of an off-duty pilot. The flight was diverted to Amarillo, Texas, where it landed safely. Osborne had worked for JetBlue for 12 years leading up to the incident. He had shown up unusually late for the flight that day. The ex-pilot was suspended from his job and charged with interference with a flight crew, but was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Court documents allege that the brief psychotic episode was triggered by a lack of sleep. Osborne sued JetBlue for not recognizing that he was mentally ill and blamed the company for endangering the lives aboard Flight 191. And it's certainly true that the case highlighted the need to perform regular mental health checks on anyone who has people's lives in their hands as a daily part of their job. Number 6. Thomas Cloyd and Christopher Hughes. The United States Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, bars pilots from drinking less than 8 hours before flying. Some airlines have even stricter standards. For example, America West has a policy against its employees drinking within 12 hours of a flight. Apparently, none of that mattered to pilots Thomas Cloyd and Christopher Hughes, who went out drinking all night in Miami when they had an early flight to Phoenix to catch the next morning. The pair stayed out at the bar until nearly 5 o'clock in the morning, when the staff finally kicked them out. They arrived back at their hotel at 5:30 and, assuming they got what little sleep they could, caught a shuttle to the airport 4 hours later. Cloyd was reportedly belligerent as soon as he arrived at the airport, refusing to throw away his coffee when security told him that he had to. Police were called and he finally complied. Staff members smelled alcohol on his breath, but he denied having been drinking. The disorderly pilot and his co-pilot were already on the plane, which had already been pulled to the runway when police arrived. TSA staff called the aircraft back to the terminal, where Cloyd and Hughes agreed to take breathalyzer tests. Cloyd's blood alcohol content was 0.091 and Hughes blew 0.084, both well above the FAA's limit of 0.04. Their careers were effectively over by then, and investigators soon found out that Cloyd had 2 prior arrests for alcohol-related offenses that he never told his employer about. The case bounced back and forth between state and federal court, and it was ultimately determined that the state of Florida had jurisdiction over the matter. Cloyd and Hughes tried but failed to get the case thrown out, and were sentenced to 5 and 2.5 years in prison, respectively. I think it's safe to say that neither of them will be piloting a commercial aircraft again anytime soon, if ever. What would you do if you were on a flight that was ultimately grounded because the pilot and co-pilot were found to be drunk? Tell me in the comments below, and like and subscribe as well for more incredible stories. Number 5. Andreas Lubitz. On March 24, 2015, an Airbus A320 passenger aircraft flying under the Germanwings budget airline crashed into the French Alps while traveling from Barcelona to Dusseldorf. It was the first fatal crash in the company's 18-year history, killing all 144 passengers and 6 crew members, and the 3rd deadliest French air disaster of all time. The impact was so great that the plane disintegrated, with the biggest piece of wreckage being the size of a car. Thankfully, the flight data recorder remained intact, enabling detectives to piece together the events leading up to the tragedy. An investigation concluded that the co-pilot, Andreas Lubitz, had deliberately flown the plane into the mountainside. At some point, Captain Patrick Sondenheimer left the cockpit, possibly to use the restroom. Lubitz locked himself into the cockpit alone and ignored Sondenheimer when he began banging on the door from the outside. The deranged co-pilot also refused to answer questions from air traffic control and didn't transmit a distress signal. He could be heard breathing steadily on the cockpit voice recording, and the passengers' screams could also be heard during the final moments before impact. Investigators found that Lubitz had a history of being suicidal, and that he'd even been denied a US pilot's license due to his mental health history, which he failed to disclose to his employer. In the days leading up to the crash, he had researched ways to commit suicide. Sadly, privacy laws had prevented Lubitz's doctor from warning Germanwings about his past mental health struggles, leading many to call for legal reforms that would allow doctors to break confidentiality under certain circumstances. While these changes have yet to happen, many airlines implemented more proactive measures to ensure that their pilots are fit to fly. Number 4. Parminder Kaur Gulati. Parminder Kaur Gulati received her pilot's wings in 2011, but it would be wrong to say that she actually earned them. After executing a bumpy landing at one airport and somehow not raising the alarm about her credentials, Gulati touched a plane down nose first at Indira Gandhi International Airport in Delhi. She was extremely lucky that her faulty moves didn't kill everyone aboard, and her errors drew the attention of India's flight authorities. A closer look at Gulati's qualifications, or in her case lack thereof, showed that she had forged the necessary documents to obtain her pilot's license. But, as it turned out, forged pilot's licenses were nothing new in India, where candidates are known for exaggerating their number of training hours and falsifying the documents in other ways. The practice has become increasingly common as people seek to bypass the requirements in order to land high-salary jobs. The incident with Gulati and several others where people were suspected of faking their credentials prompted the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, DGCA, to review thousands of pilots' licenses. Number 3. Timothy Cheney and Richard Cole. Distraction has a negative impact on an employer's performance at virtually any job, but it's especially important to stay focused when you're piloting a plane filled with passengers. Timothy Cheney and Richard Cole learned this lesson the hard way in 2009 when they lost track of time during a Northwest Airlines flight from San Diego to Minneapolis. They were engrossed in an employee scheduling program on their laptops when they flew 100 miles, 161 kilometers past the Twin Cities, failing to notice their mistake until they were cruising over Wisconsin. The pair didn't even realize that air traffic controllers were trying to reach them for over an hour. It wasn't until a flight attendant asked when the flight was landing that Cheney and Cole realized that they'd literally gone too far. By then, they'd hung up the intercom twice on flight attendants who were trying to get to the bottom of the issue. Once a mistake like this is made, it's a lot different than if you were to drive too far in your car and simply turn around with no real harm done. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, takes things like this extremely seriously, and the distractible duo were shocked to learn that they had narrowly avoided a military intercept of the flight. They were suspended from their jobs, and the FAA revoked their licenses. Cheney and Cole eventually reached an agreement with the authorities that would allow them to apply for new pilot's licenses and receive simulator training to regain their certificates. Number 2. James Fritzen Taylor. Southwest Airlines pilot James Fritzen Taylor didn't go to work expecting to make national headlines in June 2011 when he went on an insulting and hate-filled rant that was overheard by air traffic control. He didn't realize he was being recorded when he launched into a tirade over his dissatisfaction with the appearance of the flight crews he'd recently worked with, which was filled with offensive anti-gay remarks and comments about people's weight and age. The verbal onslaught came during a discussion with co-workers about plans to party together. Taylor made sure to give special recognition to Houston, Texas, for allegedly having the least attractive group of Southwest employees across the nation. A recording of the diatribe went viral, and at first nobody knew who the pilot in question was. Taylor came forward and identified himself as the man behind the cringeworthy rant, and he issued an apology after being suspended without pay. In it, he wrote that he deeply regretted his words and understood that he needed to be more sensitive and tolerant. Not everyone was satisfied with Taylor's apology, but Southwest Airlines apparently was. Surprisingly, he didn't lose his job and was instead required to attend diversity training. Number 1. Saiful Salam. In 2012, Lion Air pilot Saiful Salam was caught in his hotel room with methamphetamine and tested positive for having the drug in his system, just 3 hours before he was scheduled to fly. It was the latest among a slew of similar incidents among Indonesian pilots, reflecting a widespread and growing problem with methamphetamine abuse. In fact, another pilot who was previously arrested for possession had tipped the authorities off to Salam also being a user. The problem was compounded by a shortage of commercial pilots throughout Indonesia, as well as the rapid growth of Lion Air and other airlines. The country's middle class was expanding, and along with this growth came an increased demand for more flight routes. Understaffed airlines simply weren't prepared for it. These issues came just as Indonesia seemed to have finally mended its poor safety record that had accumulated in years prior. The authorities' swift action against its drug-using pilots perhaps reflects the country's attempt to prevent its reputation from backsliding yet again. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn about more of history's most shocking air disasters, let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe. I'll see you next time.